This is the Mookse and the Gripes podcast. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor. I'm afraid, Paul. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Now I'm a little creeped out.
Well, I finally thought, I have maybe one that's one of these conjunctions that's a little bit topical.
Perfect. I like it.
I was excited. I felt proud about that one. Thought it up a year. No, just kidding.
Yeah. The question is, where does the comma go? I'm afraid, comma, Paul. Like, you're about to break some bad news. I'm afraid, Paul.
I'm afraid, Paul. It's time to record.
Yeah.
I like doing this, though. So, but our topic today is going to be about scary books that keep you awake at night. And I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about all this. I'm anxious to share what I have to say. Mm-hmm. First, just as a quick reminder, everybody, there is a newsletter. I think more and more people that are subscribing to it, which is nice because I really think that's a nice way for us to announce here's a new episode, and here are the show notes. Here's what's coming up next. Here are just some little topics. Last week we threw in some books that are coming out over the next few weeks that we thought looked enticing. Mm-hmm. and fun. And so I think that's a fun way for us to keep in touch with listeners and for listeners to be able to respond and keep in touch with us. But, do you out there. We only release them when the episodes go up. We're not sending out newsletters left and right and in between. We don't want to flood your inboxes that way. But anyway, something kind of fun to have. And we are going to put some work into this one too to get some more recommendations out there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. And of course, as always, we're still lurking around on social media where a lot of you have reached out to us. So we'll be there too. It's not a replacement. It's just lots of good options.
Well, for months, everyone said, where are the show notes? Mm-hmm. And so we finally started doing show notes and publishing them on my blog. But even that was not an ideal place. I didn't feel for them. Or to announce things necessarily, partially because it's not something that I maintain as vigorously as I would like to, or as I have in the past. I probably will get back to it, but this looks like a good thing to do.
Yeah, something tells me that people will need those show notes after today's episode.
I'll be very curious to hear what happens. All right. Well, I am going to start us out. We're going to get into what are you reading, and we're going to talk about, scary books in general. We're going to talk about scary books or scary stories that we read for this particular episode, kind of all mismatched in there together. But I thought it might be fun to start with an email that we got from listener Christy Chess, just to set the tone.
Nice.
She says, okay, I have 2 scary books to share and a poem. Says the first is Watchers by Dean L. Koontz. His description of the heroes waiting under a window ledge, backed up against a wall, while the creature stands on its hind legs, looking in the window for him and growling, freaked me out for some time after I finished the book. The second is a children's book called The Night the Scarecrow Walked by Natalie Savage Carlson that I used to read to my son when he was small. The pictures and description of the scarecrow stalking the children. Here's from the book. A tall, lanky figure stepped from the scarecrow's post. It was draped in a long, loose coat, and the floppy brim of a hat fell over its face. It slowly stalked across the stubble. Yeah, we caught that you're reading this to your son when he was small.
Right. Scarring him a little.
The book is for 7 to 9-year-olds, and I remember reading it to my son on a dark, rainy October night right before Halloween. I think he had to sleep in my bed that night. Probably felt like he deserved that one.
Yeah, seriously. Sounds pretty amazing.
And then finally, Christy shares a poem called Little Orphan Annie by James Whitcomb Riley that has, I think it would be very difficult for me to read out loud because of the way that it is written here. I just tried it, I'll be honest, listeners, and we had to edit it out. It just wasn't working. it wasn't going to work for me. But Christy, we would love to have you send us a recording of you reciting this poem since you have
There
it
you go.
memorized.
I like that.
But I do love gotta love those wacky '60s parents scaring the crap out of their kids. Happy Halloween. And then she put a clown emoji saying somehow the clown emoji is scarier than the pumpkin, which, yes, I agree with
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
Clowns
We
have
were
always
watching
scared me.
we were watching a Bob Newhart episode last night, and there was a clown in therapy and laying in his office. Oh my god, terrifying! It wasn't supposed to be in the context of the show, but my wife and I looked at each other. We were just like, "Oh, there's something about them."
Well, and of course, I can blame Stephen King's It, but I was
Mm-hmm.
scared of clowns before I read It. I think, he had a clown probably for a good reason. It is
Yeah,
both cute and fun, and also always a little bit off.
yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Well, Christy, thanks for sharing those, and thanks for setting the tone for our episode.
Yeah.
Paul, what have you been reading?
I have been reading something that will make you very happy because I know that we have brought it up several times over the course of this show. And I keep saying I want to read it, including our nature episodes. And it's the essays of Lauren Isley, that
Yes.
beautiful Library of America box set. So yeah, something finally inspired me the other day, and I picked it up, and I've been reading through the first volume. Oh man, you're right. They are just so amazing. Both the science of it, but there's a quote on the back, and I meant to grab it and I didn't pull it out, but it's something along the lines of, Isley is the scientist with the heart of a poet, or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And man, that's exactly right. He not only is the subject matter that he's writing about absolutely fascinating, but there I was reading out loud, like stopping my wife while we were reading, like, oh, listen to this, and reading off lines left and right, because he is just a wonderful writer. The language is absolutely beautiful. The way that his mind works is really fascinating. I think it was in our nature episode where you talked about the essay. I think it's called The Slit or something like that, where he's walking along and he kind of squeezes down in between this crack in the ground, and he's basically going down through geological time, and he's talking about that as he goes, and then he comes face to face with the skull, and he's kind of just talking about how that skull, where it lies in time and what it means to evolution and all that stuff. And oh man, but
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, he's wonderful. I'm probably about 75 pages in and trying to take it slow, but unlike some nonfiction books that you might read where you kind of have to force yourself to get back into it, and you always enjoy it once you do, this is the opposite. It's a bit of a page turner, just again based on both the fascinating topics, but also just he's such a compelling writer. So thanks again
Yeah.
for recommending it.
Oh, you betcha. That's definitely one of my favorite reading experiences of like my life.
Yeah.
Is sitting down with that volume. And I think I remember reading it about this time of year. I know it was getting cold outside. I stopped at a restaurant, on my way doing some work stuff, and took it in with me. And I remember it being kind of a gloomy day outside and just settling in and reading some more of it. And it's so interesting because it's so uplifting, even
Mm-hmm.
though I don't know, it's not like, I mean, he's writing about potential, end of humanity at times, and our place in the cosmos maybe not as big as everyone has often thought in the past, and yet it's so optimistic in some ways because we are here, and we are able to see potentially,
Mm-hmm.
and to learn, and to just experience the wonders, even if we can't, and we can't comprehend all that's going on. I love that whole collection. And I'm trying here. I'm trying to find the my post about it on Instagram, because
Mm,
it has the line that you're talking about, but of course, when you try and do this live, it doesn't pull up
right.
as quickly as if I was just scanning through things. But essentially, it's like Henry David Thoreau of science,
Mm-hmm.
and not just nature writing, but of the cosmos and all of that. I love that collection.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, I assume it holds up throughout. I mean, the first 5 or 6 essays have all just been stunning. So, and I know that there's the rest of this one and then a whole another volume. So,
Yeah, I loved the whole thing. I loved the whole thing.
Awesome.
So, alrighty. Well, that's cool. Did I catch that you also were reading The Shining? Is that something you have done over the last few weeks? Or?
No, I decided to do it since I've read it quite a few times. I decided to do that one on audio. So it's been kind of nice as I'm just driving around town or, doing the dishes or whatever well, I don't know if nice is the right word, but no, I really enjoy it. I like that it's set in Colorado because there's a lot of, he talks about Estes Park and Boulder, and obviously the hotel itself is fictional, but based on that Stanley Hotel that's in Estes Park and all that, like we've talked about in the past. But I like that aspect of it, but also it's just so well done. It's just, I just read the part where the topiaries are all creeping up on him every time he looks away. He looks back and they're a little closer and they've changed their shape and everything. And I don't know that Stephen King is always good at subtlety, but that part, the subtlety of it, the kind of the creepy horror of it is so well done. So yeah, it's really good. But I also like the fact that obviously not only is there the supernatural aspects, but also kind of the alcoholism and some of the other stuff that adds, like, it's kind of nice when, again, I'm using nice, but that's not the right word, but it's always interesting when a writer can tie in some real life creepiness with kind of the supernatural, which I think is something that will come up today in quite a few of the books that we'll talk about. To me, that adds a lot of power to it where there's the two working at the same time. So yeah, but anyways, it's been nice to return to that one. It's such a good book.
Yeah, that's cool. I was going to get it for my son who's been reading Stephen King at the library, but it got checked out and never returned. They've lost their copy, so
hopefully you can request a new one or something.
Well, we'll see. I've been tempted to just go pick it up for him, but I don't know. We'll see.
A Halloween gift.
There you go. Perfect for that.
How about you, though? Yeah, what have you been reading?
So, two things as well. I finally finished last night. It's about 11:55. The Dresden Files, book 17, called Battleground. It's the last one so far. It is not the last one of his, intended, I think, 25 books. So there's, what is that, 7 more potentially, maybe even a little bit more than that, because I think he said he might have 8 more on the docket. And I also feel like some of them are breaking into multiple books. Even the books are breaking into multiple books. It's kind of how the last 2 felt to me. They both came out in 2020 within a few months of each other. And I kind of thought, this feels more like one book that was just too big for what you guys have had in mind.
He's pulling the George R.R. Martin.
Potentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a relief. Like, I've really enjoyed them, of course. I mean, I've read 17 of them over probably the course of 2 years now. But at the same time, kind of nice to say, okay, I don't have another one right now. When it comes out, I'll get to it and can take it a little bit more that way. So I don't know what I'm going to do as far as, some audio series that sometimes I can listen to, which is how I've done most of those. I have read a few of them, but for the most part, I listened to those on audiobook and, enjoyed the performance. It's James Marsters who did a role in Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Okay.
He's really good as an audiobook narrator. He's got it down. I really enjoyed just hearing how he did his stuff. That was fun. But I am done for now.
Yeah. Get a little bit of a break and then you'll be anxious for the next one.
Yes, exactly. But otherwise, this isn't coming out for some time, so I feel a little bit bad bringing it up, but also really excited. I got an early copy of the next Cesar Ira book, Fulgentius. Nice. I've been looking forward to it ever since we got the catalog that said it was coming out. And
judging by the grin on your face, I don't think you feel too bad.
Come on, Paul. I feel terrible.
Yeah,
I would never want to do this. I just feel compelled to. There might be interested listeners out there.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
But this is about a Roman general. He's 67 years old, And he, as it starts, is watching his play, a play he wrote, be put on by some of the soldiers for the communities that they're going through. And it is so funny, but this is a little bit more serious than Ira is as well. Like, this general is a little bit pathetic, but also probably very familiar, as he sits there and is totally enraptured by his own play, his own words, thinking about whether the actors are doing a good job or not, kind of looking around at the audience. There's this part here. Without losing track of the play, he glanced discreetly at the higher tiers and saw that they were sparsely occupied. It was a cold day. That had to be taken into account. Even so, why did they make amphitheaters so big? He was aware that they were used for purposes other than theater, such as the Panathenia and other large-scale events, but they were fundamentally ill-suited to tragedy, despite the warrant of a 1,000-year tradition. Apart from the fact that the actors had to strain their voices if they weren't using megaphones, precious details of expression were lost and distance hindered identification, the cornerstone of the tragedian's art. He would have pleaded for closet drama had he felt that the time was ripe for such an innovation. To be honest, Fulgentius himself was not ripe. He was a product of the Roman Empire, with all the limitations imposed upon him by the stage of civilization into which he had been born. But he just sits there and watches people and kind of, judges them. I mean, it's like watching one of these shows about, a playwright in a Woody Allen movie or something like that. Very insecure, but also super smug. And I'm not very far into it yet, but just very excited to keep going, see where this general goes.
That's awesome. And I assume it's one of his more slim books like usual, or is it?
It is slim. I mean, but it's not like usual for him. This one is clocking in at 163 pages.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually about twice as long as many of the ones that have been coming out.
Mm-hmm. So that's fun. I like that I like that he knows what he's good at, but I also like how he continues to kind of try new things and experiment a little bit.
Yeah. I'll report back on this one for sure when I'm finished with it, because we gotta supplement our Ira episode now.
Exactly. The way he writes, it's not going to be a problem to continue to talk about him, I don't think.
Right. This will maybe someday morph into an Ira podcast just in general.
Exactly.
Where we'll bring up Lonesome Dove every once in a while and Agatha Christie. Exactly. He wouldn't mind. Mind.
Exactly. I don't think we could not do that.
So, Paul, scary stories that keep you up at night. You suggested this as a topic and as a title, and it's fun and it's topical. I love this time of year. I love getting creeped out. I love spooky things. I had a really hard time thinking of stories that have ever kept me up at night, because I'm assuming the intention there is because of two things. One, it's creepy. It's hard to fall asleep if you're scared, and every little bump is, suspicious. But also it's compelling, you have to see what happens. You have to know where the story is going in order to resolve itself and not be so horrific. Yeah. What were you kind of thinking when you were putting this together?
No, that was my initial thought, and I will admit that I was a little disingenuous, because as much as I love the topic, I think you and I probably have some similar experiences with scary books where I always want that experience of being that creeped out, but I don't know that it has ever really happened. Probably, not to keep repeating myself, but by far the closest I've come was being 13, 14 years old and staying up late reading Stephen King. I mean, that was certainly the time of my life where I was just shocked and scared and horrified and all the things that, you want from horror. And part of it was probably just my age and being a little bit naive and all that. I think I'm always chasing and trying to replicate that feeling when I'm, looking at scary books and movies. And I don't know that I have ever really come up with anything that was quite that same experience. So I'm with you. Like, I love the idea of it. I think it's more for me the chase and the idea, and often I end up really enjoying the books, even if I'm not literally scared to go to sleep, you know.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I was thinking about horror in general.
Yeah.
And when it comes to horror, I'm definitely drawn to dread and kind of eeriness and that feeling of being unsettled more than, I think jump scares or, gory things, whether it's in a movie or a book, those work and they're very effective, but it's kind of a little bit of a cheap thrill or a cheap thriller. It feels like a little bit of a cheat to me. It's easy to have the cat jump out and then you relax. And then right after that, the killer jumps out or something like that. But I think it's a lot harder to sustain horror for an entire book or movie. But I also think it's more rewarding for both the reader or watcher, if it's a movie, than just something like a traditional, jump scare or something like that. So, I mean, that's where, like I said, the title, I do like the idea of chasing that. But for me, it's often more about this kind of like, just gives you the creeps kind of thing.
Have you ever been, like, let's go beyond when you were a kid. Have you ever been scared while reading a book? Whether it's a book, something that kept you up at night or not, regardless of when you read it, have you ever had that feeling of fear? Like, I am not safe. I need to get through these pages in order to get to safety. Kind of like I need to run upstairs and slam the door. I need to rush through this chapter and then shut the book.
I don't know that I have. I'm trying to think. I mean, what's his name? Daniel Lusky, The House of Leaves. You remember that book that was like a big sensation maybe 20, 25 years ago? I can't think of his first name. That one had like just a couple of glimmers of it had so much promise, and in my opinion, fell flat on his face. I really, that book, I have strong feelings only because I feel like it had so much promise. And so it's one of those where it's probably not as bad as I remember it being, but it just made me so mad because it could have been what it could have been. But that one had some moments where the house was kind of expanding and giving these hints of like other things going on that was just really creepy, but never quite followed through. But I don't think I've really had too many experiences like the one you just described, unfortunately. Like I said, it's the chase that I keep
you
trying
want
for.
them.
I want them. Yeah. How about you?
Not that I can remember, which surprises me a little bit because actually, like, movies do scare me. Like, I can be watching a movie and kind of get that feeling of, okay, I need this to keep going so that I can get to, again, to get to the other side. I know I'll be okay once some of this resolves a little bit. And can feel that fear, that creepiness that and I like that feeling.
Yeah.
My wife does not like that feeling at all. But she still lets me every once in a while bring it in a horror movie. One of my favorite memories when we were in London, we were students, so we were able to go to the theater district and buy tickets the day of, and usually they were really nice tickets for like £10 or £5. I can't remember. One particular night, they had box seats available for The Woman in Black, the Susan Hill book that was turned into the play. And they were a little bit more, but I thought, oh, that would be fun. So it's just the two of us in a box watching this terrifying but so fun play. And I still think it was a great experience. I think that was a fun thing to chase again. But she doesn't, I do think she loved that too and really loved the story. It's such a fun, creepy story. And the play is really brilliantly done. But we don't watch a whole lot of horror together. So a lot of it I just watch by myself, and I find that it's not as scary that way.
Yeah.
I just watched maybe a couple of weeks ago. Oh, what are those? Paranormal Activity, the first one. I'd never seen it before, and always thought the previews kind of looked creepy. The camera sitting there looking down the hallway, while the couple is in sleeping, and I thought it was fun. But those things don't necessarily scare me as much as I would like them to anymore.
I know.
But books have never really been able to do that for me, and I think it's a question of the medium. I don't think I have as good a visual imagination as other people do. If I'm getting it all like sciencey, I think my wife has an amazing visual imagination. She can read a book and I think she's there.
Yeah.
Completely. And I'm just not that way. And for years, I wondered why. I love reading, but then, learning a little bit more about this idea of, if someone tells you, think of an apple, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how real is that apple in your mind? How much can you describe it? And I'm not to a 10. That thing's a little vague and a little fluctuating. I know what an apple is, and I'm thinking of an apple, but it might not be as crystal clear and real as, say, one that my wife would be thinking of. And that's just how she is. And I think that that's fun. So she can get really, like, I can be sitting next to her while she's reading a book, and I'm like, she is gone from here. I better not make any sudden moves, kind of thing.
That's funny.
But I can put them down. But I also think the other question of the medium is, I think it's hard to do a sudden scare in a book. I can, maybe my eyes are skimming the page, but it's not quite the same as something that's visually right there in front of me, like in a movie that suddenly changes or shifts. But I still love a good creepy book. I often find that books can in my mind, very easily make me get that sense of, ooh, that is cool creepiness.
Yep, exactly.
And I love that, but they don't have I just don't, and maybe it's also that I put up all my defenses, and it's easier for a movie to get around those defenses than it is for a book. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite spook me the way that I guess it gives me cool feelings. I'm usually more admiring of, like, oh, that's so neat.
Yeah.
That description is so well done. That what you're talking about is so good, or even the atmosphere is so pleasantly creepy. But scared, no, I usually could just, it's time for bed, I need to put this down,
Right. No, I'm the same way. And it's interesting because what you described about your wife is very similar to mine. She will have nightmares about it, like that kind of thing. Like, it'll get into her head. So it's very interesting what you were saying about the apple and all that, because I've noticed there's a lot of readers who get into very specific details. For example, when they're reading about what a character looks like, I could picture him exactly what he would look like. And I do not do that at all. There's exceptions, maybe like in kids literature, like, again, Harry Potter or something like that. Obviously there's a lot of time spent on the descriptions of the characters. The movies probably influenced it, but I have a pretty good idea of what they look like. But generally speaking, like when I read, same kind of thing with a character, for example, I know who it is and I've been reading about them for 300 pages, but it's not like every time I read their name, I'm picturing their dark hair and the type of glasses they're wearing or whatever. So
right.
Yeah, I do. That's very interesting, that whole idea. I don't know if it's a movie can kind of remove that filter that you, as you're reading, you inadvertently probably create some filters just based on the way your mind works. And then with a movie, it's almost like they can just inject it straight into you, because it just, if something jumps out, it is what it is. And you see it the way they want it to appear, kind of a thing. I don't know, but
and they've got the benefit of music, and they are really controlling the pacing. It's not how fast I'm reading or whether I'm stumbling over a word I didn't quite capture.
Right.
A director can be really in charge of, almost pulling my hand down an alley.
Yeah.
A book, I have to walk down that alley, and it might do it at, the wrong speed or be focused on the wrong things.
Right. But like you said, it's a very different experience, but it's still, I love it. Like you said, it's admiring what they can do. It's kind of soaking in the creepiness and just letting it wash over you, which is a whole different thing, but it's still lots of fun. But yeah, I'm still chasing there's that episode of Friends where Joey takes Cujo and sticks it in the freezer because it's too scary.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm chasing. I'll get there someday, maybe.
Oh, listeners, we've got a project.
Yeah.
And we probably should have had a horror expert on with us. I'd be curious about their answers, because the ones I know, I don't know if they're ones who get like scared. That's why they love horror. I think they love what horror books examine, and a lot of the themes and exploration of the horror genre, versus I just like being scared. It's like the English major. I just love to read. Okay, there's a little more to really examine, studying literature than just loving to read. And I kind of feel like a lot of our horror friends are probably really into it because of, the extra things. And I'm sure they love the experience as well. But I'd be curious about that. Which books have kept, say, Bill Ryan? We talked about him, a couple of weeks ago, and his horror recommendations for the month. And Ben O'Connell, I know, is a big reader of horror. I think Gavin Wolcher reads quite a bit of horror in the genre. I'd be curious about some recommendations of books that they think would actually scare us.
Yeah.
And aren't, beyond being just good examples of the genre, what would scare us? Because I'll admit the other problem that I have is I'm not a big horror reader. I don't seek these books out. I don't go to the horror section of the bookstore. I don't look at what's coming out. It takes a book like getting extra attention than that for me to even recognize it, and then probably particularly personal recommendation for me to get to where I'm going to sit down and actually go and read it. And that just doesn't happen with horror very often.
Yeah.
John Self doesn't recommend a lot of horror books,
No, definitely not. He needs to step up his game. Well, one other thing that I was just, if we're talking about horror generally, I think one of the things that I feel like is a shortcoming of that genre, and this is just me talking, so maybe people can point out examples where this is not true, but so often, whether it's a movie or a book, it starts so strong. It has such an amazing premise. It's leading you along, and there's this mystery or something that's going on that is just so creepy. And I feel like I can count on one hand the number of times where a book or a movie actually follows through till the end, and actually the payoff is worth all the buildup. And it makes me sad and frustrated because I understand why, because it's a hard thing to pull off, because eventually you have to pull back the curtain, and what you see is going to never match, what people had built up in their minds.
Or what people have not been able to build up, but are, I don't think I'm ever like, oh, what I imagined was so much scarier. It's that I didn't know. And so it was very scary. The unknown is scarier than the known. And so, when they pull back the curtain, oftentimes it's anticlimactic.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. Oh, it's a baby doll. Okay. Yeah. And it's like, it's not that it's not solid, but like you said. And so anyway, that's one of the things that I was, as we're talking today, we're going to be discussing some short stories. And that's where I feel like when I do enjoy horror books, more often than not, the strongest ones tend to be short stories because of that very reason. I feel like either they can leave it alone and just never tell you, or even if they do end up telling you, it's like a shorter cycle of time. And so it's a lot more visceral and you're in the middle of it. So it's just something I noticed as I was both reading the stories for this week, but also as I was trying to think of some books that I could talk about separately. I was like, again and again, short stories seem to be, for me at least, one of the strong ways that this genre can work.
I agree with you. A lot of my favorite experience, like a year or two ago, we were out by the fire. It's kind of getting dark, but I had enough light to read Lovecraft's The Tomb to my son. At the time, he was like 11 or 12. And that was really fun. And that one doesn't disappoint. Again, I feel like some of these authors are okay leaving things ambiguous and unknown. And as frustrating as that might be, because you want to know it, that's where it keeps the fear going for me, or at least the spooky sensations going.
Yeah, no, for me, that's not frustrating. I mean, I don't want to. If they did it every time, it would get predictable. But I love it. I love being left, especially in horror, but even in a lot of other forms of literature. I'm a big fan, whether it's the ending of The Sopranos or the Blair Witch Project. I mean, I think that, to me, is one of the most powerful things, if it's done correctly, that can happen, because then it kind of eliminates this thing and let your imagination continue. I mean, I still think about both of those endings so often because you don't know. And so, I would argue that that's, again, I don't want every horror author to start doing that, because then it would take the power away. But to me, that's actually one of the strongest ways that you can end something like this, because it leaves it open-ended,
Well, so we did choose 3 short stories to kind of we're not going to analyze them in depth or anything like that, but to help us facilitate this conversation. We have Edith Wharton's Afterward, Robert Aickman's Compulsory Games, and then Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. Did any of these stories keep you up at night, Paul? Which
I
one got the closest?
I would
If you're rating
say
it on a spooky scale.
I would say on the unsettling and your mind can't stop chewing on it scale, probably compulsory games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to just dive into it?
Yeah, let's talk
Yeah.
about compulsory games then, as it's
Okay.
kind of fitting in with what we're talking about. It's not a scary story. It's
No.
not, and never is there a moment where a monster's coming, or, well, kind of. It does end with him being afraid of the moth, an airplane flown
Mhm.
by an unknown pilot, potentially his wife or the woman who used to be his friend, he and his wife's friend, but who has somehow taken over his wife's life. I mean, I'm jumping forward, but yeah, it ends that way. But it's not scary, and there's very few spooky moments, if to the extent there are any in this story.
No, it's
But
more of
it's still
a
unsettling.
yeah. I mean, anybody who's read Robert Aikman before, I talked about one of his other stories recently. He is just so odd, and it kind of is what we were talking about earlier, where there's real life things going on. It's just these pedestrian regular lives, but then something creeps into them, very often completely unexplained. And in this case, like you said, this couple lives next door to this other lady, Eileen, and they basically try to avoid her for years because she's just kind of dull. And then,
And
you know,
needy. She's
and
lonely.
needy and lonely. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, just a real quick summary. So the wife, I don't have her name in front of me right now. Her
Grace.
mother, Grace, her mother gets ill. And so she goes to, spend some time with her. And so then Eileen proposes that the husband, do you have his name in front of you?
Colin.
Colin.
Right?
So she proposes that she and Colin, have a dinner. And so it kind of seems like something might happen between the two of them. The wife's away and there's potentially this tension, and it just completely fizzles out. Nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that you think that might be the end of it. And then all of a sudden, a little while later, she starts spending more and more time with the wife.
Mm-hmm.
And it's slowly it's so weird.
It unravels. She starts spending more time away from her husband, Colin.
Yeah. And he starts to feel more and more like an outsider,
Until eventually it's complete. She's moved away. She has moved in with this other woman to pursue their dreams of flight.
Yeah, that's the weird. I mean, it's so weird. Like, they decide to start taking aviation classes and learning to fly together. Like, what? And
he always is watching them flying around, and kind of the shadow of this airplane on the ground as it goes around the community, and he feels chased by it.
And that's where I think it really started to fascinate me, is he just starts hearing this buzzing sound all the time. And he starts, like you said, seeing the shadow, and he talks about the moth, but there's like these hints of like, is it even the moth? Like, is anybody even flying this thing? And it's like, in true Robert Aikman fashion, at least my interpretation of it is, you don't even really know. Like, I mean, I suppose it is an airplane, and this guy could just be having a breakdown based on everything that's happening. But there's also like hints that it's more than that. And I think that's where Aikman is so good about, like, he doesn't hold your hand. He doesn't really tell you. And so, yeah, I don't know. I keep thinking about it.
It was kind of fun because I read this a few years ago for the first time when the book came out from NYRB Classics. And I couldn't remember it. I mean, you said, let's read compulsory games. I knew I'd read it, but I had no idea which story it was. Mm-hmm. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is where his wife goes, and he goes and has dinner with her. And as I'm reading it, flashes are coming back, but I couldn't remember the ending. And then all of a sudden it's the wife comes back and feels guilty because, clearly something has put off their friend, in quotes, neighbor. So she goes by herself to try and make amends. And that's when their relationship starts. And I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this. All of a sudden they get really kind of close. And then but I had forgotten about the whole aviation part of it. And when that pops up, I'm like, oh, okay. And weirdly, I remembered it almost like you remember North by Northwest of Cary Grant running from the airplane in the court in the field out there in the middle of America. That's kind of how I remembered parts of this story. but that never actually occurs in the story. So clearly he's having that be an underlying, pressure in the story.
Mm-hmm. But
Because I feel like that's there.
Oh, yeah.
Even though it's not explicit.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But the way I read it, because I read it the first time and I kind of was just like, whoa, like I didn't know what to think. And so I reread it a couple nights ago, and that's where it really lodged with me. So if anybody does decide to try this, I would recommend
I think two times is right.
And to me, what was so fascinating the second time is kind of watching this. I guess it's like a psychological breakdown that he's having, because he just seems like he's slowly losing it. He's seeing that airplane everywhere. He's hearing it everywhere. And near the end, he kind of goes off to this like hotel kind of area, and just some of the landscapes that they describe around there are so eerie, and it's almost like through this transformation. But there's this, I'm just going to read this one part of it's just a good excerpt of like the way Robert Aikman just drops in this like totally bizarre. So, it's talking about he arrives at this hotel, and it's giving a description of it, and it's kind of creepy. And it says, still, the unknown hotel seemed quite nice as far as one could tell, though Colin had not altogether grasped before his departure from Kensington how expensive hotels had become. And then there's this paragraph just dropped in. The machines cost enormous sums to maintain, and every day there are more of them, and huger, and more intricate, more bossy. One cannot expect there to be much wealth left over for obsolete patterns of life. And then it goes, it would have been quite jolly in the hotel room. And it just like moves on. And so when I read that, I was like, it kind of gave me the chills, because I think that is like really creepy. Like, I don't really even know where. Maybe there's a more literal interpretation of that I'm missing, but to me, it's more of just like there's some darkness going on underneath, and it might be related to the aviation side of things, but he ends up kind of going through this transformation at the end. And so I don't know if it felt very Lovecraftian to me, that part.
Well, and the thing that stood out to me this time are all of the moments where it's clear there is no real connection between this couple.
Mm-hmm.
There's an absence there that they both have kind of created in order to be content with life.
Yeah.
They've avoided entanglements. They think that the best thing to do is they don't have any other responsibilities other than work. And there's parts where, like, here's Aikman talking about when Eileen has started talking to Grace about aviation. It says, when the wine had softened both of them, this is Grace and Colin sitting there, and induced the usual illusion of fuller communion between them. Mm-hmm. Just all these parts about that they don't really have the relationship there. And I almost feel like this is Colin finding himself. I mean, it's clearly an existential dread kind of book, or story, but it's done so well. There's another part where Colin has gone off to the countryside by train. It says, there are few slow trains nowadays linking one real place with another real place. But Colin's train did stop several times before reaching his destination. Each time the noise of the wheels ceased, Colin became aware of its place being taken by aircraft noise above. So there's the aircraft there, but there's this idea of linking one real place with another real place, and him being in the middle of it.
Yeah.
He is. I don't know. It's tough to put words to that sensation of kind of an unreality. Suddenly, the things that you've depended on to form your reality are not stable and are gone. And that's what we're reading about, but in such a weird story.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Again, if anybody hasn't read Robert Aikman, I would highly recommend. The more I read of him, the first time I read his collection, A Cold Hand in Mine, and again, we keep mentioning Bill Ryan. He's a huge fan of his. I liked it, but I didn't quite know what to make of it, because it's just so unlike anything you've ever read. But the more of his stuff I read, I find myself thinking about it a lot. It's I don't know. Like you said, it's not always horror in the strict sense of the word. Probably never horror in the strict sense of the word, but talk about something that'll get into your head and just not leave you alone, which to me is one of the great things that horror can do. So.
And it's kind of cool when a story like this, that it doesn't ever, and when I say resort to, I don't mean that these are like shortcuts or not appropriate, but it doesn't ever resort to a darkened room,
Mm-mm.
or some gloom or anything like that. I mean, this stuff's taking place in the bright countryside,
Yeah.
for the most part. He longs for days when the sun is behind clouds, because then the moth can't cast its shadow.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't ever, it's kind of like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. It's mostly bright rooms and taking place in the daytime. And yet, to create a sense of unease and horror within that makes it almost more powerful, because that's the reality we often are dealing with. We're not in that state where the mind is going to sleep, but
Yeah.
you're still awake and it's dark and, it's late. Those are fun, but it's really impressive when you can have similar things start to affect the way you look at your living room at noon.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, he's often described as like an author of the weird with a capital W, and I feel like it definitely has that quality to it, which a lot of the books that I find myself drawn to as I was kind of analyzing this and thinking about the horror books that I like, I definitely think there's a theme there for me.
Well, so why don't we share, each of us, one of the books that we kind of thought of as we were coming up with this list. I don't think we need to go in depth again. We'll
Mm-hmm.
try and move through these, and get back to some of these stories and kind of keep this going back and forth. But what's one
Yeah.
of the books that you brought up?
So the first book that I thought of was Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin, and it's translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. So I don't know if you've read any of her books yet.
I haven't. I
Okay.
haven't, including Fever Dream, which is the one I always hear about.
Exactly. No, and I really liked that one too. And Fever Dream, I was reading some reviews and that kept coming up of like, that is the perfect name for a book by her because it has, a lot in common. Like I was kind of touching on with maybe like a Robert Aikman, where it almost does feel like you're just in reality, but something is off and you can't quite put your finger on it. And it's very interesting. So yeah, this collection was the first one of hers that I read. And I remember reading it, like we were on vacation and I was actually sitting in like a water slide park and reading this, which was a very odd setting, but it was so immersive that despite the screaming kids and the sunshine and everything, I was just like continuously pulled into this weird little world of hers. So um, there was a few descriptions I saw that like empty and non-specific with social rules that might as well be arbitrary was one way that I was seeing it described. And again, that kind of just reminds me of Aikman, where there's that weird, like there's doesn't seem to be any rules, but there is like an internal logic that kind of pulls you along. It's very weird. But she really does a good job of kind of letting the reader's imagination fill in these blanks, which again, that's something that I seem to really be drawn towards. There's a couple of standout stories. There's one called Rage of Pestilence, where it's kind of like the stranger walks into a town type of a situation. Everyone is really lethargic and kind of half asleep, and the entire town is covered in like dust. And he tries to intervene, but it ends up having disastrous effects. And I'll just leave it at that. It's really odd. It kind of, in some ways, like Children of the Corn, one of those where you come into this town and like it's just off, but you can't quite figure out what's going on.
Uh-huh.
Or the first story is called Headlights, and it's this woman who she just got married, and her husband and her are driving, and she needs to go to the restroom, so he's like parking outside waiting for her at like a rest station. And when she comes out of the restroom, he's gone, and there's all these other women wailing and screaming like out in the dark. And basically this lady comes up to her and she's like, "Oh, so this is your first time, huh? Yeah, they always end up leaving." And so it just kind of goes from there, and like this really odd. And then the title story, I won't read this whole quote, but I'll just read a little bit here. The Mouthful of Birds. It says, "Hi, Dad. Although my little girl really was a sweetheart, 2 words were all it took for me to realize that something was really off with the kid. And I was sure it had something to do with her mother. Sometimes I think I should have brought her to live with me, but I almost always think otherwise. Not far from the TV beside the window, there was a cage. It was a bird cage, maybe a foot and a half tall, that hung from the ceiling, empty. What's that?" "A cage," Sarah said and smiled. Sylvia motioned for me to follow her to the kitchen. That's his ex-wife. We stood by the window, and she checked to make sure Sarah wasn't listening. The girl was still sitting bolt upright on the sofa, looking out toward the street, as if we'd never arrived. Sylvia spoke to me in a low voice. "Look, you're going to have to take this calmly. Come on, Sylvia, stop jerking me around. What's going on?" "I haven't fed her since yesterday." "Are you kidding me?" "So you'll see with your own eyes." "Uh-huh. Are you crazy?" She told me to follow her back to the living room, where she pointed me to the sofa. I sat down across from Sarah. Sylvia left the house, and we saw her cross in front of the window and go into the garage. And then it skips ahead, and then it says, Sylvia returned with a shoebox. She carried it level in both hands, as if it held something delicate. She went to the birdcage and opened it, then took from the shoebox a very small sparrow the size of a golf ball. She put the bird into the cage and closed it. And so, yeah, I guess I'll read that part. She dropped the box to the floor and kicked it to one side, where it lay with another 9 or 10 similar boxes under the desk. Then Sarah got up, her ponytail shining and bouncing, and skipped over to the cage like a little girl 5 years younger. With her back to us, standing on her tiptoes, she opened the cage and took out the bird. I couldn't see what she did. The bird screeched, and she struggled a moment, maybe because it was trying to escape. Sylvia covered her mouth with her hand. When Sarah turned back to us, the bird wasn't there anymore. And so it's just, it goes on, but it's like, oh, she's very good at like, it's kind of like touching on the way that the girl is changing. So you could like read more into it of just like a father trying to deal with his teenage girl growing, and, you know, he doesn't live with her and all that stuff, but it's got this very odd and visceral, like this literally she is eating birds, and well, parents are unsettled by it, but they just don't know what to do. So that kind of stuff. It's I don't know if that was the great hook, but to me that was the story that I just kept thinking about after I was finished with this, because it's so weird. So anyway, Samantha Schweblin.
Are you picking up Seven
one?
Empty Houses, the new one?
Yeah, I'm excited about that one. I saw. Is it just now out or coming out soon?
I think it comes out I think it'll be out by the time this episode goes up. So in a few days.
No, for sure. She's very, very weird. And I will admit that I've yet to have one of her books. I've read both of them. Like, I don't know that they've yet reached like a perfect level for me. Like, there's parts of them that I don't necessarily connect with, but the fact that I was so excited when I saw a new one of hers coming out, she's definitely got something, you know, that unsettling nature to her writing that really draws me in. So yeah, it's really good.
All right. Well, I'll go with my weird choice as well.
Okay.
So it is Andres Barba's Such Small Hands, translated from the Spanish by Lisa Dillman. This was published by Transit Books a few years ago, 2017. And it's a book about a kind of a girls' school, similar to something like Picnic at Hanging Rock, where there's a girl who has some kind of knowledge. Her parents died in a recent car accident. She survived. And now she is sent to live, it's not a school, it's an orphanage with other girls, who many of whom have never really known anything about the outside world. But she does, you know, she has been out there. And it goes back and forth in this book between Marina kind of telling a bit of the story or from her perspective, and then the group of girls as a whole trying to understand Marina. And they create this game, this ritual at night that is so creepy. I'm not going to get into what they do, but it's weird. I've read this book a few times, and the second time again is where you kind of start to go, okay, now that I know what's going on, I can start to figure out why. Why is this going on? But the girls would go and play this game that Marina created for them. This is her way of being in control. Meanwhile, these girls, the group, practically, it's predatory. These girls want to connect with Marina, but at the same time, they recognize she's other and want to annihilate her. I put in my review, it's almost like they are trying to do to her what she does to them, which is a feeling of just being reduced in their presence. And so they have this game, Such Small Hands, here's the game of these kids. But I love the way that they would talk about it. They would get ready for the game when the adults leave, and they say, then in the dark of night, a strange sound would send the first sign. We'd billow like skirts in the wind. We'd start to live inside the game, the anxiety of the game. Soon, the second sign would come. There would be no doubt now. It could be anything, a whistle, the sound of creaking wood, even silence. And then slowly we'd get out of bed without even brushing up against each other, and our bodies would feel lighter. Not even then would we feel the cold of the floor tiles, be afraid of the dark. We were the cold, the dark. And so we'd go to Marina's bed, sleepwalkers, obsessed with one idea, starting the game. So it didn't keep me up at night, but it's definitely unsettling and in line with some of the books and stories we've just been talking about.
Sounds like it. That just, I mean, it may not be similar, but it kind of reminded me of a book I read earlier this year called Jawbone by Monica Ojeda. Mm-hmm. Only from the fact of like the group of girls that would get together and have almost these ritualistic games that have, I don't know if that one that you were describing has some cruelty. It sounds like it might. And so, yeah, it's an interesting connection. So that sounds really good. I feel like I've heard of that one, but I didn't know much about it. So I'll have to look it up.
It's a worthwhile read. It's very short. I mean, some novella essentially.
Once again,
whether that's perfect.
Yep, exactly.
Well, let's move on to one of our next stories. Do you want to end with the ghost story from Edith Wharton, and so we'll go on to the Cask of Amontillado, because this is an Edgar Allan Poe, known for being as gothic horror, scary, and yet the Cask of Amontillado isn't very scary either in terms of monsters or darkness. It's dark inside the human, and the way that it can be so charming, and someone who isn't a good person, but is innocent of anything that should lead to his fate. And I love this story. So I think good. I told you I used to teach this one when I taught some literature classes. Again, a lot of students would come knowing Edgar Allan Poe, but not really, or loving to read, but not really trying to dig into the why yet. It was an introduction to literature class. And this was a really fun story to dissect because they almost universally would, start it and then read to the end. They didn't, it wasn't a story many of them had any troubles getting to the end.
No.
And beyond, whoa, did you really like the story? It's like, okay, now, how does Poe make you want to keep reading? All it is for a lot of it are two men walking to a wine cellar. That's all it is. What's so fun about that? What's so compelling about that? How does he make it that you need to go on and you start to feel fear and anxiety because of two men walking to a wine cellar? And it was a good way to start getting them to analyze the hows and the effect of these on them. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. No, that would be a perfect one. And what I was noticing when I was reading it is how much of it is, it's so much psychologically based. There's his pride because he says, "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge." So it's like this, his pride has been hurt and he will do anything. And then one of the ways that he lures him down into the cellar is based on pride too, because he's like, I got this great wine in, but I'm pretty sure I got ripped off, but I know you're busy, so I'll go talk to so-and-so because he's really an expert in that. And then he's like, no, I can do it. Let's go right now, And so there's this weird psychology and this pride that keeps popping up where 2 or 3 times it's really fascinating throughout. As he's leading him down the cellar, he'll be like, "Oh, you know what? You're starting to cough. Like, we should probably turn back. I'll just go talk to that other guy. Like, he can help me with this problem." And he's kind of like baiting him and like almost giving him an out. And that creates that weird tension where you, as the reader, it's kind of like when you're reading Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books, where all of a sudden you find yourself rooting for this really nasty person. You're like, why does he keep giving him chances to get away? Like, and you almost find yourself like, not really hoping that it'll work, but you're like, it's kind of like Breaking Bad or any of those where you're like, why am I kind of rooting for this guy to not screw this up? So I thought that was one of the really interesting things about it, is just all the psychological tension that's going on inside of it.
And this is a horror story that ends right at the peak of horror as well. Like, it doesn't resolve itself quaintly. It's like you've been building up to the fear and the horror, and it's then that you have Fortunato first off being a little bit, surprised, and then some fear, and then some ha, you're playing a really good joke on me, let me out. And his screams, that's kind of how this thing ends. And you're like, wow, the real horror is what's going to happen to this poor man over the next few weeks.
I know. Well, and just the sick twist of it, like you said, he starts to probably not calm down, but like after a while, it gets quiet after he's built up the wall, and there's like one little brick left to do or something like that, and it's quiet, and he can't be happy with that. He takes the torch, basically starts wiggling it around, and then throws it in there and sets off the screaming again. Like, oh, like, talk about a sick ending. And then the guy starts screaming, and he's like, okay, now I can do it.
Oh, man. I almost want to go reread it right now because it's so fun. Why is that fun to me, Paul? That's
I don't know.
But
well, that's what I mean. That's when I like I said, with like the Ripley books, or some of those, The Sopranos, or just whatever it is. Like there's something about that, like being inside the mind of somebody who is not right, that it is fun. There's no denying that.
Well, did any of the two other books that you brought kind of lean into this type of spooky horror?
I'm trying to think.
Revenge, no. the horror of the human heart.
I don't know that they necessarily do. How about you? I mean, is there one that you could tie in?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I'll let you do that, and then I'll kind of go off on my own little trail.
Yeah, you'll get us wrapped around again. So one of the ones that I brought is a really creepy story that was filled with moments of good old creepy autumn atmosphere, and it is The Other by Thomas Tryon. Came out from NYRB Classics maybe a decade ago, and it's possible that it's really scary to me because I have a son named Holland. He's the one who likes all the horror stuff.
Uh-oh.
And this is about twins, Holland and Niles Perry. And oh, Paul, do you know anything about this story?
Only that I've had it on my list to read for years and have not yet read it. And that, as far as a few years ago, I think you and I were kind of sharing some of the creepiest NYRB covers back and forth, and that one definitely qualifies. That's all I know about it.
Yeah. So it's surprising, and I don't think going too far into it. On the one hand, some of the main events are early in the book, but knowing about them in advance probably takes away some of the power of the horror. And I mean, because usually you don't have these things happen in a book that has children. You know, they have the twins, Holland and Niles Perry, and Holland is the prankster, and they get a little bit more and more, sinister, his pranks, and it is to the point of some deaths. This is on page 54 of a book that's 250 pages, so I won't consider it too big of a spoiler, but Russell Perry, one of their friends, has just died. It says Russell Perry is in the parlor, in his coffin, open to view. It is from the parlor that the Perrys have always been buried. In the parlor they are christened, or betrothed, or married. Dead in the parlor they are laid out. It has always been so. The shades drawn, the casket on black draped trestles, looped with cords and tassels. Sighing, whispery, shadow-like forms slipping in silently to mourn, to regret, or, secretly as some will, to savor, laying warm lips against cold, unyielding flesh in last farewell. This is the Perry's way. But it's pretty horrific how all of this goes down, and then where the book goes from here. A good horror novel for sure. Nice. And one with surprises, things that it is surprising how it all kind of plays out, but definitely moments of sheer horror, as best as I can describe it. Probably the closest thing in the last decade to a book that would have genuinely had me reading and not wanting to keep going.
Wow. Okay.
So
you're selling me. Just, do you know off the top of your head, when was that one originally written? Just roughly Like, was it?
Let's see. I can look that up.
Sorry to put you
I
on the
want to
spot.
say 1967. Let's see if I'm right. Nope, 1971. So yes,
Okay.
right in that nice period of bucolic horror.
Yeah. Right. That's funny. Nice. No, I'll have to check that one out for sure. Well, unfortunately, I can't really make any strong connections because I think I'm going to be kind of one note. That's what I mean about. I was realizing
That's okay.
the types of books that scare me seem to have some very common themes. So, the one that I thought of was by Nathan Ballingrud, and it's called North American Lake Monsters.
No, you've told me about this one before.
Yeah, it's another short story collection. Surprise, surprise. And again, repeating myself, but Bill Ryan, our good friend, was the one who originally put Ballingrud on my radar. And I went back and found his blog post about this. And he said, if I had to compare what Ballingrud is doing to anything, I'd have to say his fiction is akin to the work of Larry Brown or Daniel Woodrell, but with monsters. And I really liked that description because it is exactly right. There again, it's rooted in reality. There's often these people who are going through poverty or relationships or different kind of real life, horrible things or at least tough things. And then you inject some kind of weird monster or strange thing going on. So, the title story, we follow this man who's just come back from prison, and he's basically trying to reintegrate himself into his life. He has a wife and a daughter who is now a teenager, but when he left for prison, she was younger. And so I guess in some ways it ties again into that mouthful of birds thing of just there's something going on like where he's trying to establish himself in this relationship. But like so many of Ballingrud's stories, there's this balance of kind of real life and terror. So I'll just read a real quick excerpt here. It says, after a few moments, so his daughter basically has told him, "Hey, Dad, I want to show you something. Come here." So he says, after a few more moments of trudging in strained silence, they rounded a small bend and came upon the monster. It was as big as a small van, still partly submerged in the lake, as though it had lunged onto the ground and expired from the effort. Grady drifted to a halt without realizing it, and Sarah went ahead without him, walking up to the huge carcass as casually as if she were approaching a boulder or a wrecked ship. Jesus, Sarah, don't touch it. She ignored him and pressed her fingertips against its hide. What are you afraid of? It's dead. He was having trouble apprehending its shape. It looked like a huge, suppurated heart. It seemed a confusion of forms, as though the weight of the atmosphere crushed it out of true. He had the strong impression that underwater it would unfurl into something sensible, though perhaps no less strange. Oh, I love that description so much. Like, it'd been crushed out of true, and underwater it would unfurl into something sensible. So I won't keep going, even though I could, because I think he's a really good writer. And he goes on to describe just how disgusting this monster, but also a corpse. So as you can tell, like, I mean, they don't really, it's not an existential threat. It's dead, but it's the fact that he is just walking along this cabin lakeshore and his daughter wants to show him something. He walks around the corner and there's this giant monster that's just washed up on shore, and they don't really tell you anything more about it. So that's kind of the tone of a lot of his stories that, again, I feel like there's something there that really draws me in. So it's not, again, jump out or slasher kind of horror. It's just this, like, there are things out there that we don't know about.
The
There's no
horror is that it exists at all.
exactly. Exactly. So there's another one that he in this collection called Crevasse, and it's about these explorers in the Antarctic area, and they're having a lot of the normal stuff you would expect, maybe from like Into Thin Air. Like there's some problems going on with life and death issues, but then one of them falls down into a crevasse, and there's some very supernatural hints of things that are going on underneath the ice that again just kind of gives me the willies. Ooh.
It's like The Thing or something like that.
Exactly.
I like this kind. I like those Arctic horror trope.
I do too. Yeah. And so he has another collection called Wounds, 6 stories from the border of hell, that came out more recently. And those are very much more of, they're not traditional because he is a weird dude who writes really, his mind is fascinating to me, but it's got a lot more like based in hell, kind of hellish things and demons and things like that. And it is really creepy too. And between these two collections, it's probably the more traditionally scary of the two, but partially because North American Lake Monsters was the first one I read, but also just because some of the stories in it have just stuck with me so long. That's probably the one I would recommend starting with. So
Ooh, that sounds fun.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Well, the last story that we were going to touch on in the episode is Edith Wharton's Afterword. It's in her collection Ghosts, which is a collection of her ghost stories she herself compiled, around the time that she died, actually. It has a really nice foreword preface by Edith Wharton herself that she kind of laments that with electricity and all the new technology, ghost stories and the horror they can provoke might be dwindling. But there's a lot to be scared of out there, and this one's, some of these are more scary, I guess, or spooky than others. This is a fairly traditional, I felt, ghost story.
Yeah, I agree.
Afterward, but she's such a good writer, and I just like the way this one begins. It says, "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it." And at the time, you don't know what they're talking about, but you can figure it out. They're talking about a ghost at this house, and what's happening here is a couple again. Let's see, Ned and Mary Boyne are looking for a home. The more uncomfortable, the better, because they have this romantic idea that they need to, they have this romantic idea of the past, and particularly of something probably gothic and horrific. They want there to be a ghost or a story of a ghost in this home that they get. But this is what their friend, who's kind of pointing them in the direction of this home, Elida Stare is her name, says, "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it," which is like, well, that's so fun,
Yep.
how and they, at the beginning of the story, they are talking about this every once in a while, like, well, what's the use of having a ghost if you don't know it?
Yeah.
And she says you might know it, but you won't know it until afterward, not till long afterward. And that's how the story plays out. And it's got some fun things because, this particular conversation, I love how Edith Wharton puts that they are having they're drinking tea in a June day out in the garden, but the wife, Mary Boyne, is thinking about it on a nice December evening in the creepy library.
I know some of those descriptions.
Good setup.
Yeah, it is really good. Some of those descriptions of the home, like you said, in the library are so good. And this is, like you said, in a lot of ways, a very traditional ghost story, but it's so well done. I like the fact that it's a couple of Americans who basically he's performed some kind of business deal. We don't get a lot of details in the beginning, where he's come into a bunch of money. And so they basically have all this money and they want to go, like you said, kind of naively, they're playing house a little bit, where they want to go find this, like, unadorned kind of creepy old house that's haunted. And so they
should never be happy if it's not thoroughly uncomfortable.
Yeah,
so smart.
Exactly. I know. And they're so easy to kind of like roll your eyes at a little bit, but I really like that she kind of takes that trope and drops them into it and then kind of moves on from there. And yeah, there's, like you said, her writing in particular is what's so good. There's one part where they're talking about the home, and it says, "The butter had certainly been laid on thick at Ling. The old house, hidden under a shoulder of the downs, had almost all the finer marks of commerce with a protracted past. The mere fact that it was neither large nor exceptional made it, to the Boynes, abound the more completely in its special charm, the charm of having been for centuries a deep, dim reservoir of life. The life had probably not been of the most vivid order. For long periods, no doubt, it had fallen as noiselessly into the past as the quiet drizzle of autumn fell, hour after hour, into the fish pond beyond the yews. But these backwaters of existence sometimes breed in their sluggish depths strange acuities of emotion, and Mary Boyne had felt from the first the mysterious stir of intenser memories." And I thought that was just about as good of a description of a kind of a haunted house as you could ever get, because it's talking about, there's not a lot of things have happened in this house. A lot of them have just been very normal, maybe even dull, but it's like this accumulation of memories and you can just kind of feel them in the background. I thought that was pretty amazing.
This whole collection, I love it. I love how nicely Wharton introduces each story. She has great opening lines and opening paragraphs, almost universally throughout this whole book. That, I don't know, have you explored this one much more than this?
No, I haven't. I'm actually really looking forward to it. It's been one of those that again, I say this a lot, it's been on my TBR pile, and this has really prompted me to pick it up.
They're just fun. So All Souls, the first one, Queer and inexplicable as the business was, on the surface it appeared fairly simple, at the time at least. But with the passing of years, owing to there not having been a single witness of what happened, except Sarah Claiborne herself, the stories about it have become so exaggerated and often so ridiculously inaccurate that it seems necessary that someone connected with the affair, though not actually present. I repeat that when it happened, my cousin was, or thought she was, quite alone in her house. Should record the few facts actually known. Just a fun way to begin. Here's the next one, the eyes. And this one just feels comforting. We had been put in the mood for ghosts that evening, after an excellent dinner at our friend Colwyn's, by a tale of Fred Murchard's, the narrative of a strange personal visitation. I mean, that she just jumps right into it with this one. Again, and then there's the Lady's Maid's Bell. That is probably, I think it's one of her first stories. And it's a longer introduction than those two that kind of get you in, but it's basically, it was the autumn after I had the typhoid. I'd been 3 months in hospital, and when I came out, I looked so weak and tottery that the 2 or 3 ladies I applied to were afraid to engage me. Most of my money was gone, and after I'd boarded for 2 months, hanging about the employment agencies and answering any advertisements that looked any way respectable, I pretty nearly lost heart, for fretting hadn't made me fatter, and I didn't see why my luck should ever turn. It did, though, or I thought so at the time. Just really fun little, she just really lets you in, I thought. I don't know. All of them, I think, are that way, where you just start and there's no beating around the bush before you're like, I'm in the hands of a great storyteller.
That's what I was going to say, is you can tell just her assurance and the fact that she's taking what some of these are very traditional, not a trope. I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but like she takes these kind of classic ideas, but you can just tell that she knows exactly what she's doing, and she does such a great job of pulling it off. It's really amazing.
So I think my favorite scary stories are weird ones, like we've been talking about, and also ghost stories. I love haunted house stories.
Yeah.
And you and I spoke about this a bit ago. It might have been offline. I don't know why I like them. I don't believe in ghosts. My wife gives me a hard time about that. I think she's, I don't know. I don't know exactly where we stand on all of that. But I love the possibilities of these things. I love the idea that you could stumble upon something from the past in a hallway somewhere. I love the atmosphere of, Victorian London with all of its great ghost stories, and the idea that you could be wandering down the street and see somebody walking down in a top hat, from the past. Or I don't know. I love ghost stories. I love the Headless Horseman. I love all of that kind of stuff. I love that creepiness that can settle in. I don't know why, but these are among my all-time favorite. They get me giddy, Ghost stories make me feel giddy, not scared, but in a fun, creepy way. I love them.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that's probably my problem with a lot of horror, is I'm too much of a skeptic in general to like ever truly, like if I'm watching The Exorcist or whatever, it's like I can appreciate it, but I'm just like, okay. But
yeah, that similar experience. That movie I know terrifies many people, even people who aren't, don't believe in what it's saying either. Right. Never ever has it affected me.
No, me either. But like you said, there's I when I can get into the right headspace and just kind of suspend my disbelief, and like you said, for me that seems to happen most easily with ghost stories, for sure. Because like even you think of like Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol, where like the hearse drives right through, I don't remember if it comes down the stairs or drives right through his room or whatever, and it's just so cool. But no, I'm with you. Ghost stories, and again, somebody like Wharton or Dickens who can do it so well. I think that's what a lot of it is. And I don't know if they're the ones that kind of built up. I think they were playing off of previous tradition, but I think also some of the power is that they have helped kind of sustain some of these ideas and even build them that we think today, so I think there's a lot of that too.
They're just such good storytellers. They're great writers. They can lead you, again, by the hand to
give
places
you just
where
enough.
yeah. and there's whimsy and fun, and they tend to latch on to cultural feelings. One of the things I think I like about ghost stories is they're appropriate for Christmas Eve as well because of someone like Dickens. They have that sense of security amidst the not terror, but amidst the, I don't know, the uncanny and the threatening to an extent. I just love them.
It's kind of like how we talked about how it's weird how some murder stories like Agatha Christie can be like a comfort read. It's kind of that same idea with some of these ghost stories. Like, if you think about what you're actually reading, like, why would that have any amount of coziness or comfort to it? But it kind of does. It's very odd.
So my last book that I will bring up, it is a ghost story, and it's one that I tried to find something different because I've brought it up in the past several times, but it genuinely is one of these that I can look back on. I remember reading it for the first time and it getting late and thinking, I got to keep reading this. So one that fits the bill, and that's Henry James' The Turn of the Screw.
Yes.
I just love this story so much. I love the beginning. I love the uncertainty of what is actually happening, the multiple ways that you can interpret this story. I love the richness of all that. I love it as a ghost story. I love it as a psychological collapse story. And I didn't realize this, but apparently I love creepy children, because each one of my books that I brought up today features creepy children. The Turn of the Screw, and Such Small Hands. So yes, I guess those work on me. There's something about that mixture of innocence and sinister,
absolutely,
that piques my interest, I guess. But a great ghost story. In fact, even just last night, we have some nephews in town, and they were like, "Oh, should we watch a scary movie?" And I'm like, "Oh, you guys need to watch Jack Clayton's The Innocents. It's based on The Turn of the Screw." They have no idea what I'm talking about, but I showed them the beginning where you hit the lullaby.
Yeah.
And it creeped them all out. I don't think they watched it. I think they had other things in mind, but it works. I just love that kind of stuff. So I got a ghost story for my last one. I won't go into depth because I've done it before, and it seems like most people know The Turn of the Screw. But yes, definitely one that I just love. I love the story, and I can't wait to. I need to figure out I haven't shown the movie to my kids, The Innocents. It's one of my favorite little ghost horror movies. But we're getting close. It could happen this year.
Yeah. No, I love that. Has another one of those things of just the person who is stuck into a strange situation and they're noticing things that are going on, but they can't convince everybody else, or they're not sure if they're seeing things. And that's another one of those interesting things of just like, you're kind of in that person's mind and you're seeing it along with them, but it's like they can't convince everybody else, or you're not quite sure what's going on. I love that. So good.
Well, let's hear your last one.
So my last one is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer.
Oh, I'm with you on this.
Love it. My God. I didn't mention it earlier, but if I was going to think of a book that I couldn't stop reading, and partially because I didn't want to stop, and partially because I was so creeped out, this one might be about the closest. There are some parts of this book that about as close to just being like actually scared as I've ever been, because it is bizarre, very haunting. I read it while we were staying up at a house in the mountains, and I have some very strong memories of this. So a lot of people may know between the book, and it's a fairly well-known story, I think, but Area X is this abandoned and apparently kind of unspoiled stretch of the U.S. coastline, and we're not exactly sure what's going on, but it's held under strict quarantine by some kind of a government agency called the Southern Reach. And so, it's been cut off from the rest of the world for decades. And so nature has kind of started to reclaim it, but in some very odd ways. And so very quickly we learn there's been some different expeditions that have been sent into this mysterious area to try to figure out what's going on. The first one returns with reports of this really pristine kind of landscape where everything is unspoiled. The second expedition ends in a mass suicide. The third expedition, there's basically a big shootout between its members as they turn on one another. And so the members of the 11th expedition, so it skips ahead. They've been sending people over and over again. When they come back, they're just like these shambling zombies. They're just not themselves anymore. and then within a few weeks, all of them die of cancer. And so basically where we start on this book is the 12th expedition is about to start with all of that preceding it. And so we are joining these 4 women. They're just known by their titles: anthropologist, surveyor, psychologist, and then our narrator is the biologist. So I'll just read real quickly. It says, "Our mission was simple: to continue the government's investigation into the mysteries of Area X, slowly working our way out from base camp. The expedition could last days, months, or even years, depending on various stimuli and conditions. We had supplies with us for 6 months, and another 2 years' worth of supplies had already been stored at the base camp. We had also been assured that it was safe to live off the land if necessary. We needed to acclimate ourselves to the environment. In the forest near base camp, one might encounter black bears or coyotes. You might hear a sudden croak and watch a night heron startle from a tree branch and distracted step on a venomous snake, of which there were at least 6 varieties." And so it goes from there, and then it starts describing this. So there's like the natural, like pristine part, but there's something else going on there that we're not exactly sure. It says, "Far worse, though, was a low, powerful moaning at dusk. The wind off the sea and the odd interior stillness dulled our ability to gauge direction, so that the sound seemed to infiltrate the black water that soaked the cypress trees. The water was so dark we could see our faces in it, and it never stirred, set like glass, reflecting the beards of gray moss that smothered the cypress trees." So it goes on and on. I won't keep reading. But so basically it drops you in, and you're with these explorers. They have all of this history of these failed expeditions and all these mysteries of what's going on. And then things start happening, and I won't even pretend to try to describe it because Jeff Vandermeer's mind is so weird. I don't know. There's just some scenes out of this book that have stuck with me. And I was thinking about it. I guess there is kind of a correlation because I feel like there is some ghost story aspects to this in a very different way. So it's kind of about ecology and there's like some climate change. It's not hitting you over the head, but it's like man's impact on the natural world and how we have skewed things to where it's not what it should be. But it's also looking back on some of these histories. There's people that are kind of trapped or at least beings or something that is trapped in this area that has a ghost story aspect to it, and memory and haunting, and their psychological breakdowns. And it's got about all of it that you could ever want. And boy, this book, I don't know. The whole trilogy is strong, but especially the first book to me.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's the best one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, I actually think that the first line I think of quite often. I was reading it on a holiday too, up at a lake.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
just interesting.
But I remember reading the tower, which was not supposed to be there, plunges into the earth in a place just before the black pine forest begins to give way to swamp, and then the reeds and wind-gnarled trees of the marsh flats. It's got this great map of, you can almost get into some of these fun stories we talked about with like, the Invention of Morel, where you got this creepy location that is known for its marshes and its tower, this mixture of man-made but weird things, the tower that plunges into the earth and nature. I love those kinds of stories, and this one was again my favorite of that group just because a lot more of it felt like uncertain and tentative.
Yeah, no, that's a great comparison to the Island of Morel. I actually wouldn't have thought of that, but it is like, because it just has, again, this person who's kind of plunged, or these people that are plunged into this weird landscape where on the surface it seems fairly serene, but you quickly learn it's very much not the case. Yeah, I will. His mind, like I said, I keep saying that, but he is such an odd guy, and his ability to capture these landscapes. I read several more of his books, and I would recommend anybody just to plunge into some of his books. He's got these weird things with bears going on. There was one called Borne, Borne, that I read that was just so odd, and I think about it all the time. He's a really interesting guy.
And it's those FSG MCD originals that I really like the production of their books. They're fun to hold and read from. They're well done and just good. Yeah, I second this recommendation for sure. Good. I hadn't thought about it in the context of this episode, but
well, like I said, again, it's not. I mean, this one is I guess, pretty traditionally a horror book in a lot of ways, because it's kind of almost like a haunted house going into it and not knowing what's going on or something like that. But all of the ones for me, it's like I definitely have noticed, for me, it seems to be the magic spot is where it's reality with these undertones of something that's not right.
Yeah, and this has like some sci-fi elements and some fantastical elements with like the lighthouse, and it almost has this old style landscape of explorers, with a lighthouse, for example, and maps and documents
and limited supplies
and supplies, and yet it's sci-fi and ecological horror, and it's a great one. Yeah. I do wish I'll admit I was a little disappointed in the payout of the whole trilogy.
I know. I was too.
I wish every one of them were that way, but I want to read it again to realize, well, just because it wasn't what you wanted doesn't mean that it was bad, and sometimes you got to get over that disappointment to figure out why it's good,
Right. No, I've thought of doing the same thing. Yeah. No, it's, as far as like a world, one of those books where you're reading and you are completely immersed and it's unlike anything you've read before. I think this has got to be one of the strongest books that, like we mentioned Jonathan Strange a lot. That was one for sure. And this too, where you are just all in from the beginning.
All right, Paul. Well, that's fun. And we've still got a couple more weeks before Halloween to really dig in. Of course, ghost stories are appropriate through the whole season. So, but the rest of these, we got to dig. No, no, I have been looking at other stories. I checked out T. Kingfisher. I read the Twisted Ones, kind of hoping that it might show up on this list. And I enjoyed it. A little bit of folk horror. And a play on the White Ones, an old story. Mm-hmm. And then I just got in from the library something about the dead. Sorry, it's her new one. And it's based on the fall of the House of Usher. Oh, okay. And so I'm looking forward to reading it. It's fairly short, but I am trying to find some other newer and different books to explore, because again, a lot of this episode made me realize I'm certainly no expert, but I'm also fairly ignorant to what's really out there, and would like to get to know it a little bit better.
No, absolutely. Again, just to reiterate, if anybody out there has some books or stories that they think maybe aren't on our radar, or just a recommendation of your favorite, I would love to hear it, because this is absolutely, I mentioned Stephen King so much because it was so foundational, and I keep trying to recapture that magical, scary feeling. And so I would always welcome recommendations.
Paul needs to feel like a terrified adolescent again.
Exactly. And that's all I want.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Have a happy Halloween holiday. We will be back in November with some fun episodes. And as we gear up for the end of the year, it's always exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best times. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mookse and the Gripes podcast. You can follow the Mookse and the Gripes and get show notes and book and film reviews at mookseandgripes.com. On Twitter, you can follow Trevor at Mookse and Paul at BiblioPaul. You can also get information about future shows on our Patreon. If you'd like to donate to the show, anything and everything, even $1 a month helps and is deeply appreciated. You can become a Patreon at patreon.com/Mookse. Until next time.